Hi, welcome back to another lesson. Today we are taking a look at chapter 16, which is reproduction in plants. So there are two means by which plants can reproduce. The two are sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. So before we dive into it, let's quickly take a look at chromosomes. What is a chromosome? Well, chromosomes are long strands of DNA which are held inside the nucleus, and these chromosomes contain the genetic information, the genetic coding, the information that's going to create a new organism. This set of information is known as genes, and it's our genetic code which gives us our characteristic features. For example, if you've got the gene for blonde hair, you will have blonde hair. But if you've got the gene for green eyes, then you'll have green eyes. So it's our genetic makeup, it's this genetic code that determines basically everything about us. And our genes we inherit from our parent. Now in asexual reproduction, all this genetic information comes from one parent. In plants, for example, this would mean that the parent plant produces an exact identical copy of itself to produce the daughter plant. I'm sure you've seen this. For example, strawberry plants produce a little runner, and where it touches the ground, roots start to develop and a new identical strawberry plant develops right from the parent plant. This is a typical example of asexual reproduction. The parent divides by mitosis to provide an identical copy called the daughter. Now, division by mitosis only means that when the cells divide, that they basically split. One cell will grow and split into two cells with the identical genetic information. So everything in the one cell gets copied, gets duplicated, and then the cells split to produce two cells. Now in sexual reproduction, there are two parents, and each parent here produces what is called a gamete. Two gametes fuse and they produce a whole new cell. Two different sets of genetic information come together to produce a new set of genetic information. This is called fertilization, and the new cell that's formed is called the zygote. So compared to asexual reproduction, where the daughter receives the same genetic code of the parent, in sexual reproduction the daughter receives half of the genetic information from one parent and half the genetic information from another parent. So gametes are only produced in sexual reproduction, and they are unique because they contain only half the amount of chromosomes that a normal cell would contain. Let me explain. Okay, so this is how gametes are formed in the process of sexual reproduction. So at the start we have our parent cells. These are normal cells that contain 46 chromosomes per cell. All the cells in the body contain this amount of chromosomes. These cells are said to be diploid, meaning that they've got two sets of genetic information. Di, which is here, you can see at the beginning of the word, di, in front of the di, diploid, basically means that there's two sets. So you can interpret this as two sets. Two sets, diploid. So these cells with two sets of information divide through the process of meiosis, which means that the genetic information gets split into half the amount of genetic information. So two sets here get split into one set of genetic information, and this is how gametes are formed. These gametes are said to be haploid, which means that they've got one set of genetic information. So certain characteristics of the father cell and certain characteristics of the mother cell get transferred into these haploid gametes. When these two gametes meet, for example the sperm and the egg, when they meet, they form a new cell with some of the mother's characteristics and some of the father's characteristics, and this new cell is once again a diploid cell with two sets of genetic information, half the genetic information it gets from the father, and half the genetic information is received from the mother. Now it's important to note, to make note on these diploid and haploid sets of information. Note that the parent cells are all diploid, gametes are haploid, and the new zygote is diploid. So as you saw, there are two different types of gametes. There's a male gamete and a female gamete. And the female gamete is usually larger and it doesn't move around a lot. The male gamete is usually much smaller and it travels to meet the female gamete. Now you get some organisms that produce both a male and a female gamete. Some flowers, for example, will produce both male and female gametes, and thus these flowers can self-pollinate. They can fertilize themselves. So the male gamete will meet the female gamete in the same flower, and these will produce new zygotes. So let's take a look at sexual reproduction in flowering plants. For this, it is important that you know the figure in your textbook, figure 16.4. I would suggest redrawing that figure and relabeling it to familiarize the figure. Then try and draw the figure from memory as well as label it completely from memory. This is probably going to be the best way to help you understand and memorize. So now that you've taken a look at the flower, you should know that the carpel is the female part while the stamen is the male part. This brings us to the process of pollination, where the gametes are carried from the male parts to the female parts. This is often carried out by insects such as bees, flies, any insect basically that is able to rub against the male part of the flower, and by doing so it picks up the male gamete and it transfers the male gamete to the female part of the female part of the plant, and this allows fertilization to take place. Now this can happen whereby the male gamete is picked up in one flower and carried to a different carpel, the female part of another flower, by the insect, or it can happen in the same flower where the insect literally picks up the male gamete as it passes by the male part of the plant and goes to the female part of the plant. So fertilization can happen within one flower or between different flowers. When pollen is carried from one flower of a plant to another flower of the same plant, that's called self-fertilization, because the plant is fertilizing itself essentially. When pollen is carried from one plant to a completely different plant, that is called cross-pollination, and cross-pollination is very good to help with biodiversity. It's important to note that a plant can only fertilize another plant of the same species. A peach tree, for example, can't fertilize a blue gum tree. They are not of the same species, therefore fertilization will not occur. A peach tree can only fertilize flowers of a different peach tree in the process of cross-pollination, or it can fertilize flowers on the same tree, which is self-pollination. So when a pollen grain lands on the stigma, which is the top part of the female flower, the pollen grain actually starts to create a little tunnel for itself. It starts to digest away at the stigma through the use of enzymes. It goes all the way down the style until it reaches the ovary, and there it will go into the ovule. It fuses with the nucleus of the ovule, which is the female gamete, and then fertilization has occurred. So to recap, half of the genetic information, the chromosomes, comes from the male part of the plant, the male gamete, which is carried in the pollen grain. The other half comes from the ovule, the nucleus of the ovule, which is the female part of the plant. When these two halves of genetic information come together, they make up a whole set of genetic information. This is fertilization. After fertilization, the parts of the flower that are not needed anymore die off and a seed starts to form. Now seeds are very essential in the life cycle of a plant, because certain plants can only survive in certain conditions, and these conditions might not be present throughout a whole year. So to survive, plants create seeds which will carry on their offspring and thus ensure the survival of the species. So these seeds are able to withstand conditions that the plant is not able to flourish in. For example, if it gets very cold in winter, the seeds can lay dormant underneath the snow. When spring arrives, the seeds can start to grow again. Alright, let's take a look at some past papers. So question 8 asks, when does fertilization in humans occur? Well, it's definitely not when the egg is released, that's ovulation. When implantation occurs? Nope. When sperm and egg nuclei fuse? Yes, that is when fertilization occurs. It's when the two gametes, the gamete from the father and the gamete from the mother, meet and produce a new cell called the zygote. Question 29 asks, what describes the nuclei in human reproduction? Well, so here we've got the egg and the sperm and then the zygote. Well, we know half the information comes from the egg, the other half of information comes from the sperm, and the zygote has a full set of information which has two sets of information. So diploid, di is two sets of information. So we'll take a look at these options. And so we know that the egg and the sperm are both haploid because they contain only one set of information. So C would be our answer. So question 32 here asks, which row describes the cells produced in meiosis and a function of this type of nuclear division? So the cells produced in meiosis, remember meiosis is the process by which gametes are formed. Meiosis halves the amount of genetic information. It takes a diploid cell and produces haploid cells with half the amount of genetic information. So the cells produced in meiosis are genetically different from their parent cell. They do not contain the exact same genes because they only contain half the amount of genes of the parent cell, so they're genetically different. And their function is they are produced for sexual reproduction. So they're genetically different and they produce for sexual reproduction. Well, that's it for today, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed the lesson. Good luck with the studying and go and get those good marks.